Good afternoon or good morning. Welcome to the November DALiM Tips and Tricks webinar. My name is Mike Moscato, and today we're going to be covering how to work with the color settings in ES. Just one quick disclaimer. I think many of you who attend these on a regular basis know we usually do them on a Wednesday. We're doing it on a Tuesday just because of some scheduling issues. Couldn't push it to next week because of Thanksgiving. Why did we pick this subject for this month? We've had, we get support calls every now and then, and when we look at them, we realize that the issue that's really being described is just due to misunderstanding of how the color settings within ES should be configured, be that the color space settings, the viewing condition settings, or sometimes both of them. And so I'm going to basically review the basics settings and what we tend to think are the ones that will trip you up sometimes. So we'll look at how to get it to work, how to get to do something different, and how to recognize that, oh my, the reason this thing looks squirrely is, I did something incorrect in the settings. We always like to remind you that in your go to webinar settings to go, believe not to the upper left, but the upper right, scale and zoom your screen appropriately so you can see all of the hopefully good content we're going to try to show you. Just a very quick review what we're going to try to show you. Obviously, color space, viewing condition settings, how the two work together. Are they necessary? I mean, in many, many cases, you can totally ignore the viewing condition settings depending on what you're trying to accomplish in ES. How to control those ICC settings in the viewer. Basically how to prevent somebody from getting in there and messing around with paper simulation and so forth, and how to allow it if you want somebody to play around and mess with that stuff. One thing that I think is maybe not completely understood, and I'll try to go through this fairly quickly because it's better to show stuff than describe it with something like this. But, what are the mechanics of how ES handles files in the viewer? And it's really three steps. One, ES identifies the color space that you've defined. It'll convert all the colors to whatever the working space is. Then if you have a simulation profile defined for some reason, and that and is a big thing, and it's different than the defined working space, it'll do another conversion to the simulation profile. And finally, since everything we view on our monitor has to be in RGB, it will convert that file to the monitor color space based on what your current monitor profile is on your Mac or Windows, hopefully on your Mac. And I'm not sure if I'll get to the last part, but different browsers do behave slightly differently, notably in that last portion where it has to convert to the monitor profile. Like I said, maybe we'll get to it, I'm not sure. Now, the settings I'm going to concentrate on are in your color space settings, this working space setting down here, because there's a setting down there that can cause you heartache. The embedded profile options for both RGB objects and CMYK objects, because both of those settings are settings we've seen in the past have caused issues because they were misconfigured. And lastly, we'll take a look-see at the viewing condition settings. And again, I think I'll concentrate on why you need to use it, when you can ignore it, and when it can maybe prove problematic if it's set up incorrectly. So let's jump into ES because it's much more interesting than looking at Keynote. So I got a whole bunch of different examples here. And what I want to start with is, to my mind, the most basic of the basic, which is just view a file and get it to display in a desired working space. And as I say that, I don't even remember which working space I have defined here. Let's check our job. As you hopefully know, if you want to set it up for an entire project, just set your color space. So I've got it set up for swap. And my swap color space is set for web-coded swap grade 3 paper, right? So let's just do the simplest of simple. Let's open the file. And as you probably know, if you want to verify that it is actually honoring the defined color space, you get into your ICC settings here. Try to zoom up on that. And we see that it is indeed assigning the swap grade 3. At its most basic, that's all you got to do to get the viewer to display a consistent, defined color space. Now, if you're set up so that you have access to and can change some of these settings, you can go in and turn the paper sim on, or you could have that come on by default. I think I've got an example of that later on. Some people think they want paper sim on, and then once they see it, they decide they always want it off. I think that's one of those things where opinions vary as to what you may or may not want to see. One other thing I'll mention is the images in here are RGB images, but if we put the densitometer on, it's showing CMYK values because within the defined color space, we do have an RGB source profile that is internally converting to CMYK, which is what controls the readings that we just saw here. Always, always, always remember that unless there is a twist workflow involved that's doing some conversion to a file, ES does not change the file. Even if you see readings in here that may make you scratch your head, the file has not been converted. And I'm going to show you later on how that happens and how to prevent it. But let's look at another example now. And this is where we're going to get into the instances where you may see something that may or may not seem a bit puzzling. So let's look at our job ticket, and we see that I have the exact same color space assigned that we had for the first one. So the working space is that grade 3 paper. I got 2 files submitted to it. Let's open both of them. And we're going to put them in the compare mode so we can look at them side by side. And we're going to notice something fairly quickly. Let's look at the file on the right is using swap grade 5. Wait a minute, why is it doing that? I mean, the color space is set for grade 3 paper, and we see the one on the right is using grade 3. So why are we getting 2 different results? And maybe you think, I don't know, maybe that it's really not properly reporting what happened. So let's do this. If we go to our paper sim, we know that these 2 profiles should give a very different look. One of them is warmer, the other is a little cooler, and I don't know if you can see that on your screens, but they are different. So I have to assume at this point that the one file got handled differently than the other one. So we have to, why did it do that? And this is one of those gotcha settings in color space. This file does not have an embedded profile in it, so it has no output intent defined. This guy does have an output intent defined. So what happened? when you look at your color space settings in here, if you choose the use option for output intent, ES will honor any embedded profile in the file and use that for the working space, which is what happened here. The other file that used the grade 3 did not have an output intent defined, so it used this as the default. So the rule here is if it has one, use it. If it doesn't, use him. But, you know, let's say you don't want to trust what you have coming in. Maybe you get stuff from a lot of different sources and people do all sorts of crazy things with wacky output intents, or maybe they just don't know what they're doing. So if you want a consistent working space, just tell it to ignore the embedded profile. If you say ignore, that guy is going to basically chuck to the side the defined output intent. This is that file that has the embedded profile. It had that swap grade 5 guy. If we look at him here, though, notice he's now using the grade 3 profile, which is the defined working space. The reason it did it here is I set up this subfolder and told it to use a different viewing condition that is the same as the other one, except it had that ignore setting there. So basic rule is you want one working space, that's all you want it to use, choose the ignore option under your output intent working space, that guy. But, you know, I guess it comes down to opinions vary. Some people want to do that, some people don't. Next, I want to look at something we see very often with customer settings. It's a setting that is maybe a bit benign, but also it also, I think, speaks to maybe a basic misunderstanding of how color space and viewing condition work together. This is what we'll sometimes see. Someone will assign let me make sure I get this right. Yeah, they'll assign a color space like this one. This is using that swap grade 3. They'll also have a viewing condition assigned. And they will define a simulation profile. And the simulation profile is identical to the working space. So in essence, what you're saying is, I want to convert color space X to color space X, which is basically superfluous. And I'll show you an example of it. If I can, yeah, this guy. So again, this uses that swap color space. Let's open them up. And I'm going to just kind of zoom up on this one area because this is an area I know playing with it. If it's not set up right, you'll see this. So let's tell it, right now there's no viewing condition defined. I'm going to tell it to use that one called coded 3. Now, the reason you didn't see any change is because there was no change. Because again, the working space and the simulation profile are identical. So again, it's not that that setup is causing an issue, but it is essentially superfluous. Although I will say that if you don't get these other settings set up properly, you may see a very slight shift, even if the simulation profiles are identical. The setup in the viewing condition does make some references back to the rendering intent of the working space. So you got to make sure those things jive. And just to show that the simulation profile stuff does work, let's say we wanted to look at, I don't know, we're going to print on, say, some uncoated paper. And I think you probably saw the change there, and maybe coded. So the simulation profile does behave, and it is a way to look at an alternate printing condition other than the currently defined working space. But the main point I want to make here is setting the working space and the simulation profile to the same profile is really unnecessary and superfluous.
Mike, just to interrupt you real quick, we do have a question kind of based on some of the stuff you're talking about right now, and I'm not sure if you covered it. I remember bad color resulting from working space and sim profile being the same. Did that change?
I'm not sure that it changed, but I do believe we have seen that before. But in playing with this the last few days, I'm quite certain that the reason that you will see that is if these settings down here, notice it says original working space rendering intent. So if these don't jibe with what's in the working space, you do see a shift. Because when I first set this up, I was saying, oh, this is that old thing we used to see. It was, it was something I was going to try to demonstrate. And you will see it if these are not set up correctly. So these rendering intents have to, or they don't have to, but it makes sense to make them the same as what's in the your basic working space. And along those same lines, though, this is something I know we discussed this with a customer before. What they wanted to do was, if you look at the screen here, notice again, there's no viewing condition, and my working space is as defined in the color space. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to say, oh, what happens if I change my rendering intent? And they changed it, and they changed it, and they kept changing it, and they don't see nothing changes in the display. The reason for that is the rendering intent here is applicable only if you have a simulation profile assigned. It has absolutely no effect on changing the basic working space. So, again, let's say I said, I don't know, ISO web coded. Let's see if this behaves for me. I don't know if you saw that. It was pretty obvious.
Yeah, it changed.
Yeah, and so you can see these rendering intents within the UI, again, are applicable only if you have a simulation profile defined. The double dipping thing that you're kind of referencing is something I'm going to show in one of the next examples.
Okay. Let me know if you're going to show this later. We got to follow up. What's the difference between changing your sim profile to profile X versus changing your working space to profile X?
Well, the working space is what the original conversion is performed in. So the working space is basically the base. I mean, when we go into the viewer, that ain't changing. That per default is what the initial conversion is done to. The simulation profile is a way to get a notion of what a different printing condition may be. So he's kind of an after the fact guy, but he comes first. And you may or may not have noticed it, but if there's no viewing condition defined, obviously the working space, this is kind of a dumb comment, but the working space is the working space, right? Whatever was defined in that color space. And if you want to think about it in terms of who's the parent and who's the child, right? He comes first. The initial conversion is controlled by this. And I think I've tried to make the point. These guys, these are totally optional. You could delete every viewing condition I have on here and still be able to view in a consistent viewing environment, although you might end up taking away things like being able to turn on paper sim, black ink, or any of that stuff. That's why in the next example I have, I think, at least to my mind, is one of the better examples of where a simulation profile makes perfect sense to me. And that would be this instance. I think it's here. Yeah. These are a bunch of images. They're all RGB. But we are in the printing industry, so there's a good chance they're going to print CMYK, right? So let's open a few of these guys up. Maybe this one. So notice the working space here is Adobe RGB. Well, you know, when I'm printing him, he ain't printing RGB. So this is where a simulation profile for me makes sense. Let's say we print to Grackle. What's it going to look like? That's what he's going to look like. And if I want to, you know, get in there and throw the paper sim on, you probably saw that. It was pretty obvious. So in instances where you're working with images and you want to get a notion of how they may reproduce on press, simulation profile for me makes absolutely perfect sense. And something like this image with these really oversaturated colors, you know, depending on what you might be printing them on, you may, you know, suddenly be aghast to see, you know, how that thing's going to reproduce. And just as a kind of a tertiary thing to always keep in mind, this little goodie up here in the viewer, the gamut check, is a way to find out what areas within the file are really going to be clipped, or what type of, you know, color compression you're going to get if you're going to a specific printing process or printing profile, right? Because like I said, this image has some pretty bright oversaturated colors, and you can see based on this uncoated swap thing I got, this thing is really going to push back and maybe desaturate's not the right word, but it's certainly not going to have the same vibrant look that the original did. And you know, this file, this image is kind of over the top, which I pretty much did on purpose, so you could see that these things are a pretty good indication of what's going to happen to your file. I mean, if you go to a coated stock, you know, you see something like this where it's quite a bit better. In fact, this is kind of an interesting comparison. Let's keep it on that sim profile for a coated stock. Still, obviously, it's going to do some clipping, but let's go to this uncoated, and you're going to see that the gamut check area expands into other areas that are going to get clipped and compressed. So I think that the sim profile makes a whole lot of sense when you're dealing with RGB images and you want to try to figure out what they're going to print like. One thing I should also point out is if you do want the viewer to automatically throw up for you some warnings so that you don't have to constantly click that gamut check thing, you can assign a viewing condition that has that little button turned on. So the gamut sentinel will examine a file when you open it, and if it determines there's colors in it that exceed either the ability of the monitor to display them or the ability of the simulation profile to reproduce them, it'll throw this little warning thing up to tell you, hey, you might want to check the gamut check button to see areas that are out of gamut. And the fact is that thing that basically gets triggered if you have really saturated colors. I mean, I've seen examples before where I kind of scratch my head and, you know, wonder why didn't it come up? And it's because the files, the colors in the file did not have that kind of over the top kind of look. Okay, let's go to the next example. Any questions, Fred, or can I keep going? All right, I'll keep going. Okay, this is, the example I'm going to show you now is the one that gets into this area that I talked about earlier. Well, that I mentioned. The use embedded profiles, not necessarily down in the output intent area, but up here for your RGB images, the way they're going to get treated. So what I have here, I got a file. It's the same file. It happens to be sitting in two different folders. We're going to open both of these files. And we're going to look at them side by side. And you're going to say, wait a minute, those aren't the same file. They look totally different. If we look at our ICC settings, they're in the same working space. They're both working spaces Grackle. I got no other extra mojo down here. So why do these files look so different? One has the real brightly colored, this looks a little duller. And again, this is kind of an extreme example, because if you notice, these are the images in here are tagged with the ProPhoto RGB, which is a very wide gamut color. In certain areas of ProPhoto RGB, it exceeds the viewable colors of the human eye, which is what all those little color charts and gamut triangle things are based on. So why do these look so different, although they're the same file and they're using the same working space? The difference is that this guy, make sure I look at the right one. Yeah. This guy used this Grackle color space, but he was told for any images, or more specifically, any RGB images contained in this PDF, use the embedded profile. So the source profile here was that ProPhoto, that really wide gamut guy. And what that allowed us to do is it didn't do, obviously to print in Grackle, it's going to have to do some initial compression to the file. But the other file, the one that looked kind of dirty, he used, I'm not sure which one he used. What did he use? Yeah, I should have known. It's called Grackle Ignore. Everything about it is the same, except it tells it to ignore the embedded profile and use the Adobe RGB instead. Adobe is, for general purposes, frankly, I think I would always set the color space up like this. Adobe RGB is fairly wide, wider than sRGB. But compared to ProPhoto, which is what this file is in, it's still going to have to do a fair amount of compression first and then convert that to the working space. So that's why we see this huge discrepancy between these two files. And I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is that if, and again, this is something we've had a couple of customer calls on before. If you see something like this and you know what the original file looked like that, and you start doing a little head scratching, that's when you should start looking at your color settings. And again, most notably, if the files have come in untouched, they haven't gone through any conversion and twist, and if you can't understand why they're different, you need to check your settings. One other point I'll try to make here. That bottom photo is also ProPhoto, but that's different, but there's not a huge discrepancy between the two. One's a little lighter than the other, but they're not as dramatic as the other one. And again, this gets into the point that, even if a file has a really wide gamut profile assigned to it, if the colors within the file itself are not these really deeply saturated colors, you may see a shift, which we do here, but it's not going to be as dramatic as something like that we see. Okay. Now here's my favorite one that we're going to go over now. Just make sure I can find out which one it is. I think it's this one. Yeah. We've had this more than a few times over the years. And the issue that I want to go over is the instance in which you view a file, you throw the densitometer on the image in the viewer, and you say, what the heck, the values are all screwed up here. I mean, there's two different scenarios we're going to look at for this. So let's see, we'll go to the first one. Now, in all of the cases that we look at here, we're looking at the same file. And that's what makes it kind of vexing sometimes, because you see a certain file handled differently. Let's hide those densitometer readings for now. So here's what we have. We have a really dopey test page here, right? And we can say to ourselves, let's see, that thing should be 100 black. It is. You can see the densitometer. 50C, 40 magenta and yellow. Yeah, it is. Same with that guy. So we would say, well, I certainly hope it can display something like this correctly, right? Well, here's the same file. If we throw the densitometer on it, we discover, well, that 100 black is suddenly a 4-color black. What the heck? And my 50/40 is now 46/35, and it's got 9 black. So this is where you suddenly freak out and you say, ES screwed up my file. What the heck happened? And the other odd thing is if you download the file and view it, everything's perfect. So how can something like that happen? Two ways it can happen. Here's the first way, which I think is less likely, but we have seen it happen. I got a color space here that's called problematic. What's problematic about it? My working space is a Grackle. Cool. But look what I did up here. There's a source profile defined in both the vector and the raster for CMYK that is different than my working space. So what ES assumes, it assumes that you want to do internally a conversion from coded swap to Grackle 2006. Now, again, it's not changing the file, but within the color engine, what it's displaying to the screen for you is an accurate representation of what such a conversion would be. And just to show you how consistent it actually is, this is a Twist workflow. As you may or may not know, Twist also has the ability to do ICC conversions. So I set up the ICC tool here the same as what I had the color space set up in ES. Source profile, web coded swap. Output profile, coded Grackle 2006. And this file was that file we were viewing in ES run through that workflow. So for instance, let's look at what this 100K guy is in here. This is based on the color conversion in ICC. What do we got? We have 77, 64, 69, 73. What do we have over here? 77, 64, 69, 73. And I won't bore you with too many of the other ones. Let's see, the cyan, 100 cyan, 95, 1 and 5, right? Yeah, let's put it over here. 95, 1 and 5. So what ES is doing for us in this case is, well, it's doing what you asked it to do. You asked it to give you a notion of what a conversion from that swap, I think it was swap, to Grackle would look like and what the actual numbers would be. Now, I tend to think that this is an unlikely setting in ES, unless you accidentally put something in. But this is something we see all the time, this one. Notice my working space is coded Grackle. My source profile for the CMYK objects is also coded Grackle. So on the surface, this is once again an instance in which you can say it's unnecessary to set the source and destination the same, but it's benign, or so you might think. Coded Grackle to coded Grackle, not going to be any different. We should be fine. So now I'll show you how it could be unfine or not fine. Let's see, where is that guy? Yeah, here we go. Let's clear this. So again, it's the same file. Oh no, it's not exactly the same. Here we go. Put our good friend Mr. Densitometer on, and again, our solid black is 4-color black. How the heck did that happen? Let's look at our working space. Remember, this is the working space here is supposed to be Grackle. This says swap coded. Why did it do that? You should know why it did that. The reason it did it is because I had this set again to use an embedded profile. The consequence of that is, instead of the benign setting of converting Grackle to Grackle, it actually converted Grackle to whatever the source profile was, or the defined output intent. So again, the file itself is unchanged, but what you see in the viewer is a representation of that conversion from source to working space. In this case, the working space being defined in an embedded profile. So I think we've seen a couple instances here in which this guy can really cause you some problems if you don't really know what you're getting in, or if you are really not interested in honoring what comes from your incoming PDFs. To prevent surprises, you should set this guy to ignore and have him set based on what your desired working space is. And you always have the ability after the fact to say, oh, wait a minute, I think that thing was supposed to be, who knows, maybe some sort of swap profile. You always have the ability within the viewer then, as I think we've seen several times here, to just go ahead and assign a desired simulation profile after the fact to see what it's perhaps supposed to be look like. I will point out when you assign a simulation profile, it's not going to change those densitometer readings. Those things have been cooked based on the settings in the color space, but it will give you a visual update based on sim profile. And again, sometimes it may be very subtle. It may be kind of difficult to see based on the content in the page. Okay, I think I'm running a little long. There was one other real quick thing I wanted to cover, and I think this is it. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. Notice the panel over here on the right. This is a file that's going through a project setup that requires 2 approvers, me and Joe Bob. we're going to go over to Firefox because Joe Bob's always already logged in. And what I want you to notice is he's logged in with this in the top left. He's got the same user profile that I do. So there's no trickeration here based on user profile settings. So here's what Joe Bob wants to do. He wants to open the file, and he wants to do some messing around like we were doing earlier. He wants to turn the paper sim on. Can't do it. He's got a different viewing condition he wants to use. He can't do it. So he's basically locked. He can't do a thing. Now he just finishes. He's frustrated. Ah, what the heck? I guess that file looked good. I think I'll approve it. He's going to go ahead and approve it. And you notice he couldn't approve it either. The thing didn't budge. Me, on the other hand, same file, same workflow. I can open it up and I can go to town. I'll turn the paper sim on. I want to do the black point. I want to choose, let's see, I got this goofy thing here. I'm going to use him. So why is it I can make all these changes in there and he can't? This is where you get into the notion of locking in a user to a specific viewing condition. Notice Joe Bob has that coded 3 viewing condition. Not only does it assign that to him, but when he opens it, he's locked. He cannot change it. The other thing to remember is that since he has a viewing condition assigned to him, there's the assumption then that he's not allowed to approve a file unless he's in what they want to refer to as a color-controlled environment, which from out here, where he was trying to approve it, is not. You know, he's just looking at a preview and, you know, figuring, I guess it's good. And he tries to approve it, can't do it. Now, in previous versions of ES, when this kind of user tried this, it would throw up a warning and tell him, hey, you're not allowed to do this. You have to be in the viewer to do it. Frankly, I'm not sure if it's been removed or it's a bug that it no longer shows up because it's been reported to DALiM and we'd like to see it come back. If Joe Bob is sitting in here, he can go ahead and review it, say he likes it, and you'll see now it'll move forward. Now he can approve it. But the fact is there was no prompt right now to tell him, hey, dude, you can't approve it from out here. Maybe it's just another one of their attempts to, you know, just make you crazy, which it can do. So the first thing I would look at if someone's trying to approve from out here and it doesn't budge, check to see if they got a viewing condition assigned to them, because that could prevent that from happening. I think that's all that we could do for now. Otherwise, there's other areas we could get into, but we would go on far too long.
That was good, Mike. Got a comment and a question. Comment, great point on use versus ignore. I'm going to go fix all my production color spaces now. So,
well, you know, the one thing I'll say, though, I'm of two thoughts on a few of these things. This one here, I always set that to ignore. And unless you're getting some really crazy RGB images in, this is probably the safest way to go here as well. I'm pretty sure over the last couple of years we've seen 2 cases, and they were both the same, where the images in the file had that pro photo profile embedded. And it's pretty obvious when that one shows up, because the difference between the gamut on that thing and the quote unquote normal stuff is pretty large. So I think this is for 99.9% of the stuff you deal with, that, and that are the way to go. And something I should have mentioned, if any of the attendees aren't aware of it, everything you've seen me goofing around with here has been under this mix tab. Mix tab is to deal with PDFs. But for instance, those images, the RGB images I looked at earlier, images only, not images in a PDF, are handled here. If you're throwing CMYK images in, solo images again, this option sets that. And if you get some grayscale images, same thing. Honor the embedded profile or ignore it, and always have everything in a consistent working space. Again, I think that's probably the best way to go, that kind of thing.
All right. And the last question, and 3 different questions. Can you touch base on browser compatibilities with Latitude? Is it really needed?
Very good question. I actually had that on my list of things. Let's go into Safari. Is Latitude needed with Safari or Chrome? The answer is no, it's not. So if I pop in here, this is the part that can be confusing though. Notice I got this sync monitor profile thing turned off. So you go up here at the ICC settings and you say, what the heck, the monitor profile is blank. I mean, this thing ain't working, it's not doing anything. It's not true. Both Safari and Chrome are able to automatically convert to the current monitor profile color space. So either of those browsers, Latitude is not needed. Now, the fact is, let me get that thing zoomed back down. If you want to, you can go in here and turn this guy on so that you know people don't get freaked out when they go up here and they don't see the monitor profile. And you will see that it will automatically update itself. So if I go in here and I just choose some wacky, I don't know, Epson sRGB, I don't know what that is. Notice the change. It'll automatically detect and update the monitor profile. But long story short, Safari and Chrome, no. Firefox is a different story. Firefox, although there is apparently a way to get it to behave the same way as Chrome and Safari, by default, you do need it in Firefox. I think I have my preferences turned off. No, he's turned on, yeah. So he does the same thing. He'll pick up that idiotic profile that I just defined. And if I change it back to my normal one, boom, it'll update him. There is always the option, which I find a bit loathsome, but it can be done. Let's say you don't have Latitude, or you don't want to run it for some reason, but you got some Firefoxy kind of folks. Well, their option then is to manually upload their display profiles and then choose them from the little window here to use. I mean, you know, if you have a wide-flung array of customers at different client workstations, that to me is the worst thing that I would want to do. So you pretty much in Firefox, you have to make sure they have this turned on and have Latitude installed. There's Latitude up there. You know, Latitude just runs in the background. See if there's any updates. I'm up to date. I love being up to date. Other point to make about Firefox versus Safari and Chrome is that in terms of giving you the most accurate display, Firefox is currently your best bet, especially with highly saturated colors. The reason is that in the process of converting to the monitor color space, both Safari and Chrome do an intermediate conversion to sRGB. That's something that the Canvas feature in Safari does per default. It's something DALiM doesn't have any control over, and Chrome behaves the same way. So because of that, you're kind of restricted. The sRGB is this intermediate color space it's using, which if you're dealing with a really saturated image is a bit limited. We got a couple seconds. I have an example of that. I think it's this image. Let's just do this real quick. Okay, this guy. I'm going to do the gamut check on him, right? Oh, no simulation. We want to do the monitor. Does he see anything out of gamut? No, he doesn't. Let's go back to Safari. And we're going to open the same image right here. Notice in Safari, there are colors that it considers to be out of gamut. Now again, this happens if you have some really highly saturated stuff, but you see the same images using the same monitor profile give different results. So for my money, Firefox is currently the most accurate, but again, the caveat is that's really only the case with really deep, ridiculously saturated colors like this. But there is a difference.
And the last comment / question, if you change a file's working space, do you have to rerun it through preview generation?
Oh, I wish he hadn't asked that question. Let's find out. Why not? I think you do, but if I'd done a more thorough thing, I would have mentioned it. Let's look.
I will say that was a statement I converted to a question, so let's see.
Yeah, but no, it's like this guy is currently this goofy web coded that guy. Okay. Current colors. Yeah, I'm pretty sure if I change it in the project, I'm pretty sure it's not going to update the file. So this is Grackle now. Let's see what happens. Lay down your bets. Yeah, got to run it again.
Mm-hmm. So
I think I could do this. If you do this feature, reprocess from workflow template. Let's see what that does.
Workflow template, I hadn't seen that one.
Yeah, it's been hanging around for a while, but what I don't remember is if it's reprocessing it based on the project setup or the default project template itself. What do we got? We got ourselves some Grackle now. So that did it. But the fact is, as the questioner asked, I did have to reprocess it.
Yes.
Yep.
All right. I think that's it.
Okay. I hope it wasn't too confusing because I think I jumped around quite a bit. As always, our next, well, I don't know if we're going to have a webinar in December. Will there be a December one?
There will be a December one. It should be Worldwide Technology Meeting wrap up.
Okay.
Or overview, I should say. So yeah, so I'll be doing that one after I'm back from the Worldwide Technology Meeting.
Okay. Well, everybody enjoy your Thanksgiving next week, and we'll see you next month. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.